Okay, so thank you again for joining us for our third event in our series exploring climate change and ethics. Today, our speakers are going to be investigating the roles of climate change related risks in the context of decision-making, policy, and law. I'm Kelly Loss. I'm the librarian and ethics instructor of the Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and we're really excited to have you join us today. We're going to have two speakers today, Dr. William French and Dr. Gaspard Lemaire. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes to, sorry, I'm trying to get people into the chat room. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes to present and about 5 minutes for individual questions. We're going to ask that you kind of hold back your questions for both speakers for our discussion period at the end of the talk. And since we only have two speakers today, we should have a really nice amount of time for that discussion. For the individual questions, if you could ask your questions in the chat, and either myself or Dr. Hilt will read them to the speaker. During the discussion, you should feel free, after raising your hand and we call on you, please turn on your mic and your video if you're comfortable doing so, and we can have a nice discussion face to face, which I know we've all been missing a little bit. We will be keeping track of the questions as they appear, and we'll get to you. If we don't, for some reason we go way out, if the speakers are willing, we will send your questions individually to them via email, and hopefully they can respond to you. So we'll get everything answered. We will be recording this webinar, and we'll be sharing a recording later this week with everyone who registered for the event. And please, when the speakers are giving their presentations, if you could keep your audio and video off, that would be fabulous. So without further ado, we will move on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. William French of the University of Chicago, Loyola, of Loyola University in Chicago. Try again. A colleague of ours and who's in the same area as the Illinois Institute of Technology. Dr. French is an associate professor of theology at this school. He has published extensively in the area of environmental ethics and global climate change, and his talk today is titled Mobilizing the Prudence Principle for Climate Security. And without further ado, apologies for mangling the name of your university, Dr. French, please feel free to take a hold of the screen and start your presentation.
Everybody, my name is Bill French. Sorry about that. We can pay for the Green New Deal. I have 4 main points in a proposal. First, from ethical theory, I want to sketch the asymmetry of threat perception and response. We're entrenched in this society of justifying high military spending, but we have way too little sense of urgency when it comes to ecological threats like climate change. Second, I want to sketch the history in modern American society of the idea of a war on nature. In 1910, a war on nature seemed good to William James. Today, we see nature making war back on us. Third, I examine the way America mobilized our industrial and economic power in World War II because it illustrates what America is capable of doing today to mitigate climate disruption. Fourth, for World War II, America needed to construct a military-industrial complex. In 1944, that helped defeat Nazism. But Eisenhower was also right in 1961. By then, this complex had kind of metastasized to excessive growth. So my proposal is we now need to create a climate security industrial complex and commit $1 trillion per year to fund climate security, comparable to our annual military spending. We all know the disastrous fire seasons that have been extended and the extreme hurricane seasons that have been hammering the coast, but it also, once the cameras turn off, those rains go up into the Appalachians and lots of flooding events occur. The natural events, I don't need to recount them, but the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change called this a code red for humanity. We have a massive double standard of threat perception. It's like 2 different silos. Why high military spending? Well, we're used to that. We're used to the threats. The only national threats that we perceive are hostile foreign powers. And then after 9/11, the potential threat of international terrorism. Why the low response for climate change concerns? Well, basically, we haven't, they're very new, relatively speaking. And also we've had lies from the big coal and oil interests, the fossil fuel industrial complex that has funded a decades-long climate change denial campaign. The Koch brothers and ExxonMobil have been the main funders of that campaign of disinformation. The idea of a war on nature, shifting history in 4 stages. Stage 1 in 1910, William James, the United States' finest philosopher of his day, called for a moral equivalent of war. He felt the weaponry had grown too horrific, and so but he liked what war historically has done in sustaining strong virtues like courage, discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice for the common good. So he wanted to eliminate war, but find a war substitute. He was thinking in the aftermath of big things, big engineering things to make the world better for humanity. So he called for youth brigades of all nations to be joined in a common endeavor, namely what he called the immemorial war against nature, where they would chop forests, build roads, drain swamps, stuff like that. Now, the assumptions are fascinating that in 1910, a war on nature could be seen as a good thing with no human casualties. So that means, in his view, the natural world is, of course, a passive, vast, and stable given. Nature will take whatever we dish out, no problem. The 2 world wars absorbed the world's attention for a long time. It was during the Cold War period, the post-World War II period, that we began to focus on lots of air and water and nuclear pollution cases. Stage 2 was when ecologists began to get frustrated that the broad society were not hearing their message. Barry Commoner is especially interesting. He argues we know that nature's reactions can cause real and massive human casualties, so William James was wrong. Barry Commoner's great book, Making Peace with the Planet, implies that the problem is we're making war with the planet. We got to stop it. There's a 3rd stage. War on nature is really, really bad. And this begins kind of in Gubbio, Italy, among conversations of geologists. Walter and Luis Alvarez. Walter's the younger man touching this seam of strata. And an Italian geologist pointed out to him that below that seam, there were thousands of species of forams, little one-celled fossilized sea creatures. Above that strata, there were maybe 10 or 15, so a huge die-off occurred. The strata is marked by charcoal and iridium is very rare and it's associated with meteorites or asteroid hits. The Alvarez father-son team and others wrote Extraterrestrial Cause for the Cretaceous Tertiary Extinction in Science. You can Google it. Other scientists began to confirm that there, in fact, was an asteroid strike off the coast of Cancun, Mexico, and that this may well have led to the decline, the demise of the dinosaurs that kicked up so much smoke into the upper atmosphere, smoke and dust, that the cloud cover blocks solar rays hitting the Earth, and that kills photosynthesis. Now, Carl Sagan and a team of scientists asked, well, if an asteroid could do that to the dinosaurs, then what might a nuclear war do to humanity? And Sagan and his team did a lot of computer modeling. And in this, at the bottom of the screen, I keep moving people around. In one of the cases that they looked at, case 17, this is a day of detonation where my cursor is. And so they held 100 days after a nuclear war, a big scale war of 10,000 megatons, all that dust and smoke in the upper atmosphere going global, that the global temperature range would be on the Fahrenheit scale, roughly 100 days in, roughly minus 50 degrees. And then if you extrapolate this line up, it hits maybe 40 degrees. So if the day of detonation is in May, then you've wiped out 2 full growing seasons in the Northern Hemisphere. So they worried that this could lead to a doomsday threshold where 500 to 2,000 nuclear blasts could cripple 2 growing seasons and perhaps lead to the extinction of humanity. Not happy thoughts. He didn't say it, but I extrapolated from it and others that this means that, say the Russians launched and the United States chose to do nothing. Well, the nature of the United States, the targeted ground, would react whether we launch a second strike or not. That means that nature itself is a system of energy and needs to be understood as a superpower with a retaliatory capacity. If it holds a retaliatory capacity against a nuclear strike, it surely does in an age of mounting climate disruption. Stage 4, climate change, we see nature making war back on us, as Bill McKibben says, in a world at war. McKibben's my hero. Tremendously important climate activist and scholar. He argues we're under attack from climate change and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II. Carbon and methane now represent the deadliest emergency of all time, the first force fully capable of harrying, scattering, and impoverishing our entire civilization. Carbon and methane are seizing physical territory, sowing havoc and panic, racking up casualties and destabilizing governments. It's not that global warming is like a world war, it is a world war. He argues defeating the Nazis required more than brave soldiers, it required building big factories and building them really, really fast. This was the spur to our military-industrial complex. Tom Brokaw has called the Second World War generation of Americans our greatest generation. I haven't really liked the notion of greatest generations. They all have different challenges. But looking at the buildup of the industrial complex for victory is very important. FDR reached out to Bill Knudsen, the president of General Motors, to head up the National Defense Advisory Commission. Oops, sorry, going backwards. So it was a joint venture between big government and big corporations, and the ideology today of anti-big government is quite naive, I think. Knudsen had a sense of urgency. He had just been through Europe checking on General Motors factories, and he saw Germany's rush for war. He persuaded FDR to cut the process of seeking competitive bids for factory production of tanks and airplanes. Knudsen rightly felt that was too slow. He persuaded FDR that the government should pay the cost of any new needed factories to jumpstart corporate buy-in. And he persuaded, he persuaded FDR to agree that the government would reimburse corporate costs and guarantee on top a 7% corporate profit. Labor bought in as well. Pearl Harbor was the catalyst for this and this and this. Check out the light green line. The United States took its tank production from near zero in 1941 to almost, 28,000 tanks produced in 1942, kicking it up to almost 39,000 tanks in 1943. Bravery helped win the war, but also an industrial surge of weaponry. The US spent roughly 41 to 43% of our GDP to win the war. Huge. Why not mobilize like this in a time of planetary emergency? This chart I love. It's the tracks US national defense spending as a percentage of US GDP. So here's the World War II surge, but this is the area, the period that I'm also very interested in. In the Cold War from say 52 to 68, that period looks to me like the average would be about 10% of GDP. avoid this. So mobilization costs money. So FDR had to expand the tax base. So he expanded the number of families that had to pay taxes, but he also kicked up the taxes on America's wealthy families to the top historical tax rates of 94% in the top marginal tax bracket. This rate kicked in on families whose income was over 250,000 per year. In today's dollars, that would be roughly 2 million. So here's the top federal income taxes, the history of it. So they peaked in World War II, but look at they stabilized across many decades at 70%. So AOC is right. We should return to higher tax levels on America's wealthy class. We have profound needs. And here's our corporate tax income. And if you look over here, I have to move faces around. This is what President Trump did to take our corporate tax level to a historic low. An estimate of US military budget. Well, if you Google US military budget, you're going to get a figure like 760 billion per year. But that doesn't include all these other, it doesn't even include overseas operations. It doesn't include veterans affairs. It doesn't include Homeland Security or the National Nuclear Security in the Department of Energy or the Homeland Security budget. You total it all up, we're approaching 1 trillion a year. The magazine Nation argued that it was closer to 1.25 trillion per year. This is 2021, and the source is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, argues that US military spending is larger than the next 11 countries combined. But our economy has grown, so in absolute numbers, we're the world's absolute military superpower, no question, in terms of spending and conventional power and nuclear power. But our economy has grown so remarkably that we can spend that amount of money and it still is less than 4% of our GDP. Whereas during the Cold War, we were spending on security around 10% of GDP. So they estimate in 2020, 3.7% of GDP. Now, my proposal is that America needs to energize a new climate security industrial complex. I want to differentiate the good military industrial complex that helped win World War II and the bad military industrial complex that is bad for the reasons that Eisenhower named it bad, that it sucks up too much needed funds. It hypes foreign threats to sustain arms manufacturing. So my proposal is an annual climate security mobilization budget pegged to our current scale of annual military spending. Another route would be cut our military spending in half and shift half of it to a climate security budget. But politically, I don't think that's a sell that you can make. So our current defense spending is roughly 1 trillion per year, roughly 4.3% of our GDP. So my added trillion annual budget for climate security would push us to a total national security spending package of about 8.6% of GDP. This level of security, I'm trying to argue that history shows it's doable. Why? Because we did it. We've proven that it's doable. You can't say that this is impossible. And that's the third type of climate change denial. One's a flat out denial, it doesn't exist. Second is a denial, well, climate change may exist, but it's not caused by humans. The third is, well, climate change exists and it is caused by humans, but gee, we just deny that we can't afford to do anything right now. Well, I'm saying we can afford to do lots of things right now. So the current estimate of US GDP is 23 trillion. That's how I get my figures. I can't even read that top. How could we be guided by World War II and Cold War tax levels? Well, we could just recover top tax brackets, and not just on income. We've got to tax wealth too, because the wealthy Americans are very adept at hiding wealth. This is what national security used to look like. And this, what an ecologically informed understanding of national security looks like. And this, we need a climate security industrial complex. I chose that. We need to follow complex A. That's the joint effort for government raising taxes and helping corporations to buy in to quickly ramp up industrial production for increasing solar and wind capacity. Just the way the military industrial complex harnesses the lust for corporate profits and labor forces lust for jobs, if we can get an industrial complex lobbying Congress in the same way, only not pushing for weapons development, but pushing for expanded solar and wind farms across America, we must ramp up non-carbon emitting power sources, and we must support a climate finance fund to help other developing nations mitigate climate change and grow their development path towards solar and wind and away from fossil fuel. It's especially important because America is in some ways the chief climate perpetrator. We have a huge burden of responsibility for a cumulative historic buildup of atmospheric carbon. Thank you. Sorry if I went over time.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting and kind of reframing this in terms of looking at World War II as a case study and, you know, how we can ramp up things and really kind of use what we've done in the past to approach climate change in a new way that would potentially be very effective. I'm curious, and then we'll open up for questions. You know, one of the, and this is probably maybe applied ethics for me, I don't know. World War II, we had a tangible enemy where we could focus on and say, this is the problem. It's very clear, lives are being lost, things are in chaos. It's easy for the public, for members of the government to say, we see where we need to put the money and put our efforts. Climate change is diffuse. Some countries are seeing it every day. Some of us, we only see it, you know, in parts of our lives. So I'm just curious, when you're dealing with a problem, and I see the kind of the war analogy working here, but how do you frame this so individuals can see the very real risk and danger we're facing, you know, with, you know, looking back to the case study of World War II and how we ramped up in the US for that war?
No, that's excellent. And you put your key finger on it. I think that to see the story, we have to, as a people, learn to connect disparate dots. There are something like half of the American counties in the last 2 years have experienced extreme weather events. And so it is personal in many parts of the country, and it's noted by coastal mayors, whether they're Republican or Democratic, that every East Coast city and Gulf city has to worry about the next extreme hurricane event. The Houston area experienced an unprecedented rainfall of 60 inches of rain. I forget, was it Hurricane Ida? So we need to track and have people like McKibben help us turn it into a narrative. It's a global narrative of not just extreme weather impacts and rising seas in the Gulf and the East Coast, but it's a global narrative that you've had extreme flooding in India, killer floods. But in many parts of the country, well, we had a crack in our foundation of our house, and we called in companies to fix the crack, and we got it fixed. It was very nice. I had to do some of the fixing too. But I asked one of the men, this is a Chicago repair construction company. I said, "Are you seeing increased problems with wet basements?" And he exploded with stories about, oh my God, yes, absolutely. It's pounding everywhere. And we're not historically equipped to frame these little stories as a national security threat. That's why we need people like McKibben and President Obama and other voices to speak up and draw our attention. Because the problem is, once you push climate change, we're at 1 degree centigrade global heating. These are irreversible. We're pushing irreversible trends. So I don't have any easy answer of how to personalize it other than this is why people like McKibben, who turn it into a grippable narrative and use the analogy of war, that might be one educational vehicle.
Thank you. Roger, I'm going to save your question to the general discussion if you don't mind. But Marcia and Andy, here's a question for Dr. French. What are some of the key investments to which the new money should be directed, or who should decide this, since there will be a big fight over any new money available?
Great question. The notion of the Green New Deal, and I'm not, all that into the specifics, but it strikes me that we got to ramp up solar and wind power production rapidly. And Obama's clean energy plan that got shot down was to encourage all states to close out their coal-fired power plants. So shifting to a solar, wind, and geothermal economy, and maybe even safe new age nuclear power plants. So how to do that? Well, that will provide jobs. That's a good thing. And these should be sited, not just in areas with good wind, but I would think you need to, the construction of these can go in places like the south side of Chicago that has been hammered by deindustrialization. It can be sited in Appalachia, where the closing down of coal mines, it accelerated under Obama. And even though Mr. Trump sucked up to the coal industry, nothing he did stopped the bankruptcy of coal companies. And so we need to subsidize, like we have subsidized in the 19th century, the railroad industry. We subsidized and nurtured the oil industry. We gave mineral rights. It takes big government to create the context to help incentivize big corporations and little corporations to jump in to reduce our carbon footprint nationally, to reshape our cities, to have growth borders around the edge of every city so that we're less dependent upon private auto usage, and recover the streetcar systems that used to provide excellent public transit for our citizens. And if we're talking about giving aid to foreign countries, we have as much a stake in helping other countries reduce their carbon footprint, because their carbon footprint goes into a common humanity-wide carbon footprint. That's just a pot shot of a response.
Thank you very much. So if you could save your questions, if you have any more, till the general discussion. Just for time, we're going to move on to our second speaker. And thank you again for Dr. French for that really interesting presentation. Our second speaker is Mr. Gaspard Lemaire, who is currently a predoctoral fellow at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Pardon my French. He completed his first master's degree in public policy at Sciences Po Paris, and a second one in philosophy at the Sorbonne Université. He has also worked as a parliamentary assistant in the French Senate for the past 2 years. Mr. Lemaire's talk is titled Anthropocide, a Crime Against Humanity. And so please feel free to take control of the screen, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for this introduction, and many thanks to Professor Hills too for the organization of the webinar. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. I hope everything is working fine. So my talk will focus on the notion of anthropocide, and I'll explain what it means in a few seconds. As you probably know, we are currently facing a carbon emission pathway, which is going to lead us to a 2.3 degrees to 4.6 degrees Celsius increase in the midterm. And this implies that innumerable human lives are going to be threatened around the world. The experts estimate that at least 420 million people are going to be affected by rising seas, for instance, by 2100. And the UN also predicts a doubling of the number of people who are going to suffer from hunger by 2050 as a result of climate disruption. And these threats are resulting from activities emitting greenhouse gas emission. And these activities are performed by people who know perfectly well what they're doing, who can anticipate the consequences of their decisions. So on the one hand, we have people who are going to be harmed, and on the other hand, we have people who are acting knowingly, know what they're doing. So it seems clear that we're dealing with a crime here. But the problem is that the exact nature of this crime is far from being clear. And I believe that the currently available juridical, criminological categories that are available do not make it possible to account for the criminal nature of the actions leading to climate change. These actions threaten the greatest part of humanity. So it might be tempting to believe that these actions constitute a crime against humanity. However, the notion of crime against humanity is defined in the Rome Statute, which determines the functioning of the International Criminal Court as a set of acts which are performed intentionally and which are committed as a part of a widespread attack. And this is not the case with the activities leading to climate change. The effect of the actions leading to climate change are not intended by those performing it. And these actions are not even performed in a coordinated way. So we're not exactly dealing with a crime against humanity, even though most of humans are being harmed. And for similar reasons, we're not dealing with a genocide, which also implies intent. There is another notion, the notion of ecocide, which might seem adequate to describe what is going on from a criminological point of view. Ecocide refers to the destruction of a local ecosystem, for instance, the destruction of a river, the destruction of a forest, etc. But the problem here is that climate change involves a global destruction and not the deterioration of this or that ecosystem. So we're not dealing with ecocide either. And therefore, it appears that the activities leading to climate change constitute a crime without a name, to quote an expression which was used by President Churchill in 1941 to describe the then ongoing Nazi atrocities. And this was 3 years before the concept of genocide was invented by the Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin. So in this presentation, I will try and develop a new concept, the concept of anthropocide, which aims to account for this unprecedented crime we are currently facing. And this concept can be designated by the term anthropocide, and this is from the Greek anthropos, which means human being, and the Latin caedere, which means to kill. So basically, anthropocide is the killing of human beings, but I'll expand on this and the meaning of this concept. And secondly, I'll focus on the question of responsibility for this crime, and on the question of the penalization of anthropocide. And finally, I'll deal with the question of the recognition of this crime. So what is anthropocide about? The notion refers to a set of deliberate actions or omissions that result in the destruction of the essential foundations of multiple human groups, and that are even likely to lead to the extermination of some of these groups ultimately. And these actions or omissions are characterized by the fact that they significantly contribute to climate disruption and consequently to the increase and to the intensification of climate disasters, such as droughts, hurricanes, extreme precipitations, etc. So that these actions or omissions are simultaneously at the origin of several phenomena, such as land degradation, the destruction of ecosystems, decrease in food production, and shortage of basic resources. And as a consequence, these criminal actions or omissions lead not only to the disorganization of economic life, of political and social institutions, and of the culture of the group they harms, but they also lead to geopolitical instability and to massive forced migration. And they also imply a violation of fundamental human rights, such as the right to life, the right to health, to freedom, personal security, and to dignity. And consequently, anthropocide prejudices the majority of the members of the human community. So I'll briefly comment on this definition. It is a well-established principle in criminal law as well as in international law that one can be held responsible for omissions as well as for actions. So this is not really a problem. What is maybe more difficult to grasp is the idea of a deliberate crime, which is to be distinguished from an intentional crime. A crime is intentional when it is motivated by the harm inflicted. On the other hand, a crime is simply deliberate when it is committed knowingly, when the effect of the criminal act are known by the perpetrator. So here we're dealing with a deliberate crime, but not with an intentional crime. And finally, anthropocide is a crime which is based on a human rights approach. But I think it's important to develop a new concept, because the urgency of the climate problem forbids any entanglement, so to speak, in the ramification of jurisprudence. And we need a single category that allows us to avoid an indefinite multiplication of procedures. Now, it might seem that there is a problem at this point, because climate disruption is the result of a multitude of actions which are undertaken by countless individuals as well as countless firms that do not act in a coordinated way. So it might seem impossible to identify those responsible for anthropocide. However, I think that the actions of these various agents, individuals, companies responsible for climate change are very likely to be strongly influenced by the decision of states, not only because of the weight of the state apparatus in the economies of most of the greenhouse gas emitting countries, but mostly because of the prerogatives of states in terms of regulation. States have the power to significantly influence our behavior. And therefore, the responsibility for the crime of anthropocide rests with states, because only their action is likely to prevent climate disruption. However, it's clear that not all states should be held responsible for this crime, and that those which are responsible are not all equally responsible. So how to determine the level of responsibility of each state? Here we can use a very simple indicator, that is the emission of CO2 equivalent per inhabitant in a given state. So as you can see, there are huge differences with respect to this indicator. And if the level of emissions of a given state is unsustainable, then the state has to acknowledge its responsibility for anthropocide. And the threshold of sustainability could be defined by reference to a global budget, a global carbon budget. For instance, a budget allowing to avoid a temperature increase higher than 2 degrees Celsius. And other parameters would have to be taken into account, such as historical responsibility or the ability to adapt. And so, what does it mean concretely for a state to acknowledge its responsibility for anthropocide? Well, first of all, the state in question has to commit itself to use all means at its disposal to put an end to this crime. The state would also have to commit to financially compensate the other states that have been harmed by contributing, for instance, to a compensation fund, not an aid fund, such as is the case with the current Green Climate Fund, but a compensation fund that would be sufficiently endowed so that most of the individuals affected by climate disruption could be adequately protected. Now, another important question is that of the Court of Competent Jurisdiction. And here, this is not such a big issue since we have the International Court of Justice. We do not need to create a new court. The International Court of Justice is established by Article 92 of the United Nations Charter, and it is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, and its function is to settle disputes submitted by states. So it could settle disputes related to climate change. But what we need is a convention that would be ratified by the different states, a convention, for instance, on the repression of anthropocide. But this might seem a little bit utopic. This proposal faces a major difficulty because climate law is currently being built at the national level rather than through international conventions. What we have is that at the international level, climate actions are part of a negotiation logic rather than part of a legal logic. And it might be feared that a proposal to penalize activities that lead to climate disruption would cause some tensions among the most emitting states. So we definitely have a problem here. We might even fear that the notion of anthropocide would be counterproductive. A first answer would be that anthropocide could work as an epistemic tool for the scientific community in order to better understand the moral implication of the Anthropocene, this new era we have entered. And the Anthropocide could also contribute to shift the frontier of what is tolerable in terms of climate. It could serve, for instance, as a watchword for civil society and for climate activists. But it could also be useful from a legal point of view. For instance, the most voluntary states in terms of climate action, could consider recognizing the crime of anthropocide at the national level, for instance, by means of a non-binding resolution that could nevertheless be taken into account by national courts. And states could therefore publicly pledge not to commit the crime of anthropocide. Moreover, we could imagine a similar mechanism at the supranational level, for instance, with organizations such as the European Union, which could thus affirm its willingness to respond to the climate emergency. Another level of action would be the United Nations General Assembly, which could also adopt a non-binding resolution to recognize the crime of anthropocide. And all these actions could lead to a shift in the balance of power. And once the balance of power is more favorable to the victims of climate change, then finally, maybe a convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of anthropocide, a binding convention, could be finally be adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So very quickly to conclude, is this completely is this a complete utopia? I do not believe so. I believe that we have here a clear plan of action. And I also think that it might be interesting here to briefly review the history of the concept of genocide. Genocide was invented in 1944 by the Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin. And as soon as 1948, genocide was recognized by the United Nations. And Raphael Lemkin enjoyed no particular political support. He had no particular connections. He was an immigrant in the United States. And when he died, only 7 people attended his funerals. So what this man did all by himself, all alone, I believe that we can achieve the same thing collectively. We still have some time left. We are not doomed to turn the planet into an open air oven. And yes, I believe that there still is time to act, and that anthropocide could play a role in the fight against climate change. So there are many outstanding issues, and I can wait to listen to your question and to your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that really interesting talk and providing this kind of definition that really kind of hardens and clarifies what our responsibility is, what the ramifications might be or are in a lot of ways, and then providing such, some really concrete ways forward of using this definition. I love the parallel between genocide and anthropocide, and I think it's a powerful new kind of term of vocabulary to think about the moral implications of our actions in this sense. Rather than me taking up time asking questions, I have a couple. I'm going to open it up to the audience. Would anyone like to ask specific questions? Jane McLeod says, both conversations have been really interesting. Thank you, William and Gaspard. So I agree, this has been a fabulous presentation so far. Any questions?
I put a little note in, I put a little note in the chat. I was screen grabbing a lot of the interesting slides, if that's okay, but I just missed William's final slide, which was the conclusion. So if I could get the final slide, that would be really great.
And William, we could help with that if you're willing to share your final slide.
Can you see the screen?
Not now.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. We can also send it too.
Thank you.
Via email, if that's all right.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
The final slide was just a continuation and a wrap up that's saying why it's doable and it's important. And I thoroughly agree with Gaspard. It's excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Any questions for Gaspard specifically? So I think you talked about this a little bit, but I was interested, how does your definition of anthropocide kind of potentially change the dynamics of our current conversation about climate change? It definitely kind of hardens the potential implications of it. But how do you think it might change kind of among nations, this conversation? A lot of it's kind of, I think we see how we frame harm in one way, but you frame harm in a very hard and fast way. I think it calls back to us, what our responsibilities are. I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
All right. Thank you very much for this question. I believe with Kant that the function of a concept is to organize reality. Kant says that concepts organize a totality, that is to mean the unity of a diversity. And this is really the aim of that concept of anthropocide. Climate change is a very complex phenomenon in itself from a scientific point of view. And you have to organize all the different scientific facts with the current political and moral systems prevailing in our civilization. And the function of the concept of anthropocide is to ensure that correlation is to, as I said, is to shift the limit of what is to be tolerated and what is not to be tolerated. As has been emphasized by William, in our collective imagination, the worst thing that happened to our civilization from a moral point of view is Nazism. And undeniably, the Holocaust is a massive horror. But I think that we have to become more aware of the moral significance of the beginning of the Anthropocene, of this new geological era. And yeah, basically the idea with Anthropocide is to help to make this move forward from a moral point of view.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hill, I see your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question. It may be a little bit indirect, but it's for both speakers. And it's about, I mean, both are about negative concepts, to put it that way. In the war on nature, war against nature, and anthropocide is also a negative concept, which is about killing, I mean, yeah, going on war, killing, having people killed, genocide, which is all, I can see all these contexts, I can see those implications, but I want to say that in the applied ethics debate, a lot has been around protecting species, protecting the environment, protecting nature, basically, and seeing analogies between nature and human beings, kind of saying from a pathocentric perspective, they all suffer, we have to protect them. Even from an anthropocentric perspective, we need them, we need the environment, we need, not the environment, we need the nature around us, and all of this. So a lot of these attempts are about harmonizing, kind of connecting humans and nature, and both your approaches are seem to take a different direction, to put it that way. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, your response on my interpretation. I may be wrong, this may not, I mean, I'm just curious to hear what you say about this, both of you.
Well, we make war against a Hitler and Nazi regime to stop it, to stop destruction and genocide. I go back to kind of the notion of problem and solution. And for Barry Commoner, the problem is human practices of consumption and production are having unintended side effects that, as Gaspard put it, are causing massive destruction and future threat. So the solution is, as Commoner explained, is quite a positive one. We don't talk about the bad stuff because we want to wallow in the bad stuff. We're against that. We want a stable global ecosystem with a stable climate. And so the solution will be a certain path, a policy path that will shift us away from heavy carbon emissions. So I think ethics always names a set of actions that are problematic because you have an ideal goal of a positive goal in mind, say conflict mitigation with the planet.
Yes, I completely agree with William with the idea of anthropocide, as well as with the idea of a war against climate change. The aim in the end is to protect human beings who are being affected by climate disruption. Now, you asked why to protect humans rather than nature more generally, or the earth in general? And this is a very interesting question. I think we have to recognize the interdependency between human beings and the environment. I don't believe that there is such a huge tension between ecocentrism and the so-called anthropocentrism. Once you recognize that the human being cannot survive when he has destroyed his own life, you see that the protection for human rights and the protection for animals, for ecosystems, for plants always go together. Now, it is true that the two questions, protecting the nature on the one hand and protecting the human being on the other hand, are linked, but they are not completely similar. And one of the objectives of the notion of anthropocide is to complement the notion of ecocide, which is an existing notion which is very much discussed among scholars and which has been recognized by some states in the world. And the point with ecocide is to protect ecosystems as such. And this is very important. And for instance, ecocide could be used to face the sixth mass extinction, which is a very important problem linked to climate change, but once again, different from climate change too. And the idea of anthropocide is that we also have to protect human beings. Even if we want to protect nature, we are not going to let go human rights. We cannot say it doesn't matter anymore. So we have to join forces. And yeah, this is the point, I think, of a war against climate change, as well as of the notion of anthropocide.
Thank you. Roger, I apologize. I let your question slip by. So I'm going to quickly go to yours. You asked earlier, everyone I know agrees we must all do something, but not me alone. My friends won't even write to their political representatives. How can we change that? The climate emergency is technically easy to resolve, but requires action by international politicians to enforce change. And I just reposted his question in the chat. Anyone want to have a go?
How do you motivate people, right? Usually in religious ethics, historically, the use of narrative and story. Keep framing issues so they can see the significance. One of the wonderful things that Gaspard did, I think, in your talk was frame it as a crime against humanity. That when I think of, wow, the investment of oil and coal companies in their resources that are still underground, and they're looking at that as a potential profit stream for the next decades. They're huge financial interests. So how do we as a people take that away from private corporations? Are we going to compensate Exxon for its reserves that we simply cannot allow them to continue to pump out? So one, like, I don't know, legal ethics would say, well, fair compensation. But wait a minute, what if their basic product line constitutes a foundational crime against humanity? So I think that's an eye-opening concept. And for too long, we've had a political discourse in this country, the United States, of, oh, national security, that's really serious. We'll get around to environmental threats maybe when we can afford to. And so I try to use a narrative, but it's an educational process, and we might want to remind people. That's why the role of churches, civil society, groups, how do we motivate people to get active? I don't have an easy answer. But I know Bill McKibben works very hard to frame it in a storyline that can be digested quickly.
Yes, it is true that the question of the relation between individuals on the one hand and collective action on the other hand is very important. And in this respect, yeah, it might be helpful to underline the fact that most of human beings are being affected by climate change. Now, maybe a legal solution could be to penalize climate in such a way that state leaders could go to jail. I consider the option of penalizing states directly, but who is responsible in the end? In the case of crimes against humanity, as they are framed currently in international law, crime against humanity are dealt with by the International Criminal Court. So it is leaders, state leaders, leaders in the army who are being incriminated. Now, should that be the case with climate crime? I think we have a problem here because we need state leaders to act, and we also need them to recognize some sort of international climate law. So if we threaten them with jail, then it's obvious that they're not going to agree, they're not going to want to go to jail. So yeah, this junction between individual decisions and collective actions could be achieved if we penalize states and not directly state leaders. We could also incriminate corporations, right? But here again, we need a legal mechanism, and it isn't clear that we have the framework to implement such mechanism right now. On the other hand, we have a legal mechanism to incriminate states. We have the International Court of Justice. So this could work. And once states recognize that they have to stop climate change, then they can take domestic measures, domestic public policy to ensure that companies working on their territory stop emitting carbon. So yeah, we could have everything wrapped up in this idea of a penalization oriented towards states.
Thank you. I just very quickly, Marcia, I saw you had two questions in the chat. Roger, is this a follow-up to your question or is this a separate question? Because if so, we'll go to Marcia's question and then we'll get to yours.
I suppose it's a follow-up, really. It's just that I'm
okay, yeah. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, it's just that I'm very depressed about it all. I mean, we had the COP26 conference in November, December last year. John Kerry said all the right things on behalf of Joe Biden, who says all the right things. Alok Sharma for Britain said all the right things, but it still doesn't get done because India and Russia and China, and it's all very well talking about the international court, but I mean, the countries which are most at fault in all this don't even recognize the international court. It's a psychological problem, and we just haven't got the first idea how to solve it. I say, I'm not a public speaker. I can't even persuade my friends having coffee together to write to their MP, to their personal representatives. So how can we persuade governments to act? I'm sorry, it's just I'm moaning and groaning again, but it's we just don't seem to have the first idea. We know that the technical solutions are easy. We've known about global warming since the 19th century, and we still do nothing. Sorry, I'll shut up.
I find it important to try to figure out domestic parallels to say, when we spend on national security, what is that? Why do we have such excessive national security spending? I would suggest that environmentalists talk about the prudence principle, but we never really talk about the prudence principle that the Pentagon applies, which is, in fact, when it comes to national security, the threshold for action, the threshold for smart action is always being prepared for the worst case scenario. And that's like, okay, so that's the core reason we buy insurance. So people who have car insurance or homeowners insurance, we can get our minds around the threshold for action is not the certitude of a worst case scenario, but the possibility of future harm. So we've been spending for decades, nations spend lots of money on their military. And by analogy, it shouldn't be too much of a stress to be able to reach people in their pocketbook decisions of everyday life that we need to listen to experts, plumbers, carpenters, electricians, and that the nation and we need to buy insurance against mounting threat. I share with Roger pessimism and depression.
Yeah, I completely agree with William. The current pathway is could be really despairing. We're not going the right direction. We're not doing things fast enough. This is obvious, and we have to recognize this fact. It is very important not to be naively optimistic. However, I don't think that we can afford depression, because depression leads to inaction. So we have to act. We know that, and we know that our actions lead to something. Our actions have effects. And another thing that we know is that eventually things are going to change. I mean, humanity is not going to be destroyed. This is very unlikely. At some point, a change is going to occur. And the only question is, when is this going to happen? You know? And right now it seems that it is going to happen too late. Too many people are going to suffer. Too many people are already suffering, and we have to recognize this once again. But we also have to recognize that we have the power to do things. We have the power to influence the future. And we know that we are going to have this moral shift. We know that at some point, people are going to look back and say, how has this been possible? Yeah, I believe that individually we all can contribute to accelerating the movement, which is necessarily going to happen. And maybe a final remark would be that in order to convince those who refuse to act, for instance, for economic reasons, say, no, it's too costly, as could have been the case during the war, it's too costly, it's not good for the economy, we could answer that it's not too costly. It's clear by now, since the Stern report and since other econometric articles which have been published, that it is less costly to invest now than to wait for the future. So even if you give up the logic of human rights, from a purely economic perspective, it is better to act now than to act later. And this could be a very powerful intellectual tool, you know, if we could convince our leader of this reality. Unfortunately, it has not been emphasized enough by the IPCC in its last report. But you have a lot of work done regarding this question, and yeah, we have to transmit these ideas.
Thank you. Marcia, I have not forgotten your question, I promise, but Mary A wanted to add something to this conversation. So Mary, do you want to go ahead?
Sorry, I wanted to say that there are a lot of things that are going on positively within the industry, within research, within even developing countries, and also locally, that are going on in your local community and internationally. One of the things that people need to think about and how they consume a lot of the news and research to kind of fight against the depression is to pick something that they are interested in and to follow that field, and also sometimes contact the people who are doing the research. Not all of them will be closed off and will reject you. Some of them are very open to communication, even open to communicating with young people, students, basic like citizen people who are interested, as long as people show an interest. So that's where I'm gonna start, and then I'm gonna make a comment about the governments. I think this is what you guys are talking about, like on the big macro level. So these governments are basically representations of us as citizens in the world. If we do not want these guys to be our governments, there are mechanisms and ways that we can be politically involved and active. One of the messages that I found very distasteful growing up in a country where we did not have like a, what is it? We had to fight for independence. We lived through coups, wars, just a lot of stuff, is coming to North America and finding out that so many people are disinterested in the political process, that they're super negative about the political process. Even my mom, who's here, my mom, I have to take her, obviously, because we're like, that's how immigrant families are. The younger people kind of like, acclimatize their parents to do what is needed. But my mom is the one who taught me about it's important to vote, the importance of the vote, the importance of democracy, and that you don't need to always vote for only one party. So in my family, we vote, I think it's called strategically. We understand the consequences of what's going on. We pay attention. We do research. We are not more advanced than other people. We are not middle class. We are not rich. We don't meet a lot of whatever you guys call markers. We don't speak English. We're not English fluent speakers. But in my family, even from since I was a kid, we would discuss what everybody in our family is doing. We would do mock votes. This is even before we would go to school and do mock voting. And then we would see which political parties are in favor, which political parties are not in favor, why we need to vote for certain parties. We do the research. And then when we go out, of course, I have to trust my family to vote. But, we and my parents always did try to teach us to understand the process and what we're doing when we go and vote. So for me, it not is is not disheartening. It is very, I think it's like baffling and maybe angering that so many people here in these countries that have had democracy and are lucky to be living in democracies are so disinterested in the politics, because a lot of this is going to happen through the politics. And the message that is going to young people is that politics is boring. Oh, politics is not for you. Oh, don't go there. They're always fighting. Yes, it's about fighting. This is democracy. Yeah, it's not always fun. Yeah, yes, it's boring. It takes work, but those values are not being like taught. And so I don't know if you are interested in like a climate solution or solutions to be implemented, then you have to be politically involved and politically engaged and politically educated, and then you need to spread it around. It's very important.
Thank you, Mary. That was, my husband's a civics teacher. So I think we need more people like you and your family who are politically involved, engaged, and, really pushed people, our governments, to take action. I'm going to jump back to a question we had earlier from Marcia. She asked for a case study, and I just repeated this in the chat. Our state legislature plans to widen one of the interstate highways and to add 1 or 2 interchanges with other highways. The legislature does not intend war on nature, yet in the balance, this is very costly to nature. These costs to nature and thus humanity are unintended. In the law, unintended effects are covered under concepts like negligence and recklessness. And anthropocide suggests an analogy to murder one. Could there be a category of diminished responsibility? We might call it, somewhat unfortunately, anthroposlaughter.
All right, thank you very much for this suggestion. Well, let me precise that with anthropocide, we're not dealing with a murder exactly. As I tried to emphasize, a very important feature of anthropocide is that the crime is deliberate, it is committed knowingly, but it is not intentional. People do not want to kill other people through climate change. This is just not happening. Now you referred to a third category, which is negligence. And negligence is even weaker than a deliberate action, because in the case of negligence, what we have is that someone should have foreseen the consequences of her actions, but did not. But is still responsible for the consequences of these actions, because she should have been more cautious. She should have thought more about what she was doing. Now, I don't think that we really need to appeal to this third category, because in the case of climate change, well, we know what is going on. Maybe the notion of anthroposlaughter could be useful to describe what was going on in the 1980s and in the beginning of the 1990s, maybe, when we were not sure yet. We had many informations, we've had the Meadow report, but the scientific facts, the scientific evidence emerged during the 1990s. It was more robust, it was more clear that we were doing something really awful. So yeah, maybe it could be used as a historic concept. Thank you very much for this suggestion. I think about it.
Any other questions? We have one from Marsha, but I just want to give other people a chance to ask. If you have any looming ones, feel free to either raise your hand or just stick it in the chat. While we wait, I will get to Marsha's second question. So she says, Stephen Gardner, in an earlier Illinois Tech session this year, recommended a global commission to guide the transition of managing climate change. There's much to be said in the favor of the UN taking on this task, as Gaspard perhaps suggests. Yet I am unclear on what the UN's authority is so far as to manage resource production and consumption. Is anyone here familiar with precedents at the UN for managing petroleum, coal, solar, wind, etc.? Or do new powers need to be established for the UN, or must there be another organization to manage energy resources? And again, it's reposted in the chat.
Well, the UN has done yeoman's work in pushing the annual climate summits for years in a very frustrating fashion. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the most authoritative body of assessment, but we're stuck with a UN that has a Security Council that makes the big decisions and can veto anything. So, you know, I'm not hopeful on that. If I could just point out, I liked what Gaspard said a while ago about it's not a competition between human rights and a human-centered ethic building arguments because of the dependency of humanity on the well-being of nature, that there's a strong relationship. So too, we need to do a better job, perhaps, speaking specifically about the economic benefit of a green energy revolution. I would commend that Americans are motivated, as are French people, as are people around the world. They need jobs. In many parts of our country, there's been a tremendous loss of jobs and a lot of human suffering, and that pushes a polarized political system. So we can be strategic, as the way Bernie Sanders and others, in talking about the Green New Deal. Solar and wind power can come to local communities and produce lots of construction jobs in retrofitting rooftops. And so there's a documentary, Carbon Nation, that makes the pitch for that this helps build communities in local areas that have been waysided in economic growth.
Yes, I really think that it's important to emphasize this economic dimension of the problem. I'm not sure that, as was implied by the question, the UN needs to manage directly resources. It would be sufficient. It's already a lot, but it would be sufficient to have a binding convention which would determine a level of per capita CO2 emissions, and then states could just manage their emissions. I think that here the subsidiarity principle applies, and that states are better able to organize national economies. But of course, this is not what is happening right now. What is happening is a general waste, and this could be emphasized. Another notion I'm working on currently is the notion of destructive creation, reversing, so to speak, the notion coined by Schumpeter, creative destruction. The idea of Schumpeter is that as new technologies appear, less competitive sectors of economy are collapsing. Now, what does destructive creation mean? This concept refers to the process which continuously revolutionizes the structure of the wealth production, which constantly creates value, but which also constantly imperils the possibility to make use of the world capital. We live in a capitalist regime, this is undeniable. But what we're doing is that we are endangering the world capital. Some economists foresee a decrease in the world GDP by 30% in 2100. This is a very dramatic estimate, but it's a possibility. We have to deal with this possibility. And I believe that what we are facing is a crisis within capitalism. Before, we had a conjunction between the idea that we could accumulate capital on the one hand and that we could have profits on the other hand. It went together. But now the logic of profits is threatening the very idea of the accumulation of capital. The world capital is in danger. We're destroying natural capital, but we are also imperiling infrastructures, buildings, etc., etc. And this is completely new in the history of capitalism. And maybe this would be also a way to be more efficient if we could emphasize this radical change in our economies, which is maybe under theorized right now. I don't know.
Thank you. Any other questions at all? We have about 5 minutes left. And there's been an ongoing discussion in the chat with which I will save, and it might be worthwhile reading. Some doubt about what the UN has achieved, and I think we're all a little frustrated with some of the progress, but I think both of our speakers have offered some really interesting solutions for moving forward if we can get some impetus behind them. Well, if there are no other questions, I will take this opportunity to thank both of our speakers for a really fantastic webinar today. Really appreciate all of your ideas and and concepts. And thank you for all of our participants for your excellent questions. We will go ahead. If you do have anything else you'd like to share, feel free to put it in the chat. Leda says, brilliant talks. Thank you so much. Jerome says, a lot of good information. Yeah, thank you again. So with that, I will thank everyone, and I hope you all have a good afternoon or evening, depending where you're located. And this is our last talk for this semester so far, but if you do have ideas for other talks you'd like to hear about climate change and ethics or other speakers, we are very open to hearing about them. Really appreciate everything. So I'm going to go ahead and close this meeting, but thank you again and hope you all have an excellent day.